I started doing genealogy when I was 16 years old, back in 1969. The first time I visited the National Archives was 2 August 1969. So I've been part of this history of genealogy, at least the last third of it, I'll say, for all of my life, although I've been much more active later on than earlier on. So let's talk about it for a bit. So today, we're going to talk about genealogy being as old as history, what it was like in antiquarian times, then what it was like as we entered the 1700s and then into the 1800s, and then the creation of various lineage societies and those kind of things, and then what happened with roots and what's happened since the web exploded and those kind of things, and try to put it all into perspective so that we can actually figure out what's been going on. So genealogy is actually older than history. And what I mean, it's older pretty much than written history, because there is this oral tradition that goes on. And the earliest evidence that we have in regards to genealogy that most people in the United States are familiar with is the book of Genesis, where the descendants of Adam and Eve are described in chapters 4 and 5. And then the descendants of Noah are described in chapter 10. Chapter 4 is Cain. Chapter 5 is Seth. Poor old Abel, he doesn't get a chapter. And chapter 10, of course, records the male descendants of Noah. And then we go further on into the genealogy of Jesus, and there are actually two accounts in the Bible. One in the Gospel of Matthew that starts with Abraham and goes to David, and then one in the Gospel of Luke that begins with Adam and goes to David. And there isn't much issue about getting from either Abraham or Adam to David. But then after David, Matthew takes 27 generations to get to Joseph, and Luke takes 42 to get to Joseph. And they don't overlap, and they even seem to skip some generations as they go along. So I've seen worse genealogies, but it's not really let's just call it not a well-cited source. Genealogy continues for quite a bit. Lots of people will descend from Muhammad. In fact, probably all of you descend from Muhammad and don't know it, but the link is probably tenuous, as are the citations. Pretty much everybody descends from Charlemagne, one way or the other. But in antiquarian times, genealogy was the basis for claims for monarchs to their thrones, and when a king would die, people would start presenting their genealogies if it wasn't quite clear who the heir would be, and wars get fought over such things. But genealogy in this time period was definitely not the activity of ordinary people. In fact, if an ordinary person knew who their grandfather was, it might be a thing, and definitely not likely to know their great-grandfather. Whereas nobility, that was a little bit different. So if you have an interest in the kings and queens, there's a family tree online put out by the National Portrait Gallery that's been recently updated with Charles III coming to the throne with the death of Queen Elizabeth. And it follows the monarchy from 871 to the present day. Now, I have a connection to Henry II that actually I can prove. And so I, like you, likely descend from nobility in England, being probably the last son of the last son of the last son. I don't descend from Richard. I descend from John Lackland, but actually no, I actually descend from Ida the concubine. And I'll show you how I figured that out as we go along. Now, there are all kinds of neat things out there. Here's a tree of Elizabeth I. And the English aren't the only ones. Here's the Austrian monarchy. And you can see how intricate and how detailed these are. And you won't find generally a single source on any one of them. A couple of years back, the Genealogical Chronicle of the Kings of England to Edward IV in Latin, an illuminated manuscript on vellum done in 1466, sold for $215,000. It's got pretty colors. Now, there are some modern books that deal with the genealogies of kings and queens. David Hughes's book on Chronicle of the Kings and Queens of Britain, from the earliest time to the present, is a 2-volume set. There's another author out there by the name of Douglas Richardson who's done several different sets of books. One is Royal Ancestry, and that's where I think I've determined that I descend from Ida the concubine. Another is Magna Carta Ancestry, which deals with the barons. Now, the barons aren't necessarily monarchy, but they are, in fact, nobility. So you want to be sure that we're dealing with both nobility and the monarchy themselves, because generally what happens is nobility becomes monarchy over time, depending on the situation. Richardson has another book on the Plantagenet ancestry also out there, and many of these are multi-volume sets. Until about the 1700s, genealogy just belongs to the nobility. But then we have something called the gentry. Now, these aren't nobles. These are like the level below nobles, the level below barons. These are landowners, and we begin to see an attempt on the part of American colonists to secure some measure of social standing. So you'll see William Armstrong Crozier's book on Virginia Heraldica, a registry of Virginia gentry entitled Two Coats of Arms, with genealogical notes of the family. So you will find in colonial Virginia tombstones that have heraldic markings on them. And this was to establish that they were better than anybody else. In other words, it was the issue of social standing. But after the Revolution, we encounter a problem because nobody wants to be nobility anymore. We're a republic. And so for several years, identifying yourself as being gentry was not a thing. It was anti-American. But as time passed, we see that genealogy begins to come back into the fray as a way to counter the new republic's egalitarian, future-oriented ethos. I'm not really sure what that means, but it was a way to, it was now safe to have some sort of social standing by connecting back to that British nobility. Whereas in 1790, that really wasn't a good thing. And this happened because as 4th of July celebrations commemorating the founding fathers and the heroes of the Revolutionary War became popular, it was now okay again to pursue antiquarianism. And focus on local history became very popular. Now, about the 1820s, we begin to see certain people creating works. The first being John Farmer, and he's followed by James Savage, then John Banks, Charles Henry Browning, and Arthur Meredith Burke, to name a few. Now, John Farmer, in 1829, does a book called a genealogical register of the first settlers of New England. And this is probably the first published genealogy for the common people that was done. And it's been reprinted several times by different genealogical publishers. So he sort of is the beginning of it all. Now, recognize before this time, lots of people would lie. That's a good way to put it. And his effort was to not lie about it. And there were people all around him who were lying about genealogy in an effort to connect people to the nobility in the past. They would do that for a fee. Now, after that, James Savage expanded Farmer's work to 4 volumes, and it became the Genealogical Dictionary of New England. And it's now, this genealogical publishing company set is now available in paperback. It's no longer available in hardback. I'm fortunate to have, since I've been doing this for so long, to have a lot of these hardback books still in my library. And about the time that happened, the New England Historic Genealogical Society comes into being in 1845. And what's interesting, I mean, it still is extant today, of course, and it still publishes the Register, just as it began publishing it in 1847. And I've actually held an original 1847 volume in my hand, and I gave it to a friend of mine who lived in New England and was very close to HISGen as a birthday present once. She was very pleased. But the nuance here is originally they wanted to title it the New England Historical Genealogical Society. And they received such guff from the Massachusetts Historical Society that they had to change the name, in spite of them sharing boards of directors. So they became the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And again, they've been publishing the Register since 1847. Now, a little later, Charles Edward Banks published some books on the English ancestry and homes of the Pilgrim Fathers, the Winthrop fleet of 1630. These are the people that came after the Mayflower folk. And then he did a 3-volume set on Martha's Vineyard, and he also did a history of York, Maine. And these are also all available. And you can see that none of these actually were driven by living people as much as they were driven by connecting bunches of people to people in the past. And then Charles Henry Browning, he actually went so far as to leave the United States and go to England so that he could work on royal lineages and people would hire him. And a couple of his books were Some Colonial Dames of Royal Descent and Americans of Royal Descent. And both of those are still in print, but there's what the original looked like. And then finally, there was Arthur Meredith Burke, who also went to Great Britain to work on royal lineages there. But he published Prominent Families of the United States in Great Britain in 1908. And his book was based on information provided by individuals. I still don't trust individuals. The individuals are not sources. So you have to take some of these books with a grain of salt. Now, this Burke is not to be confused with the Burke of Burke's Peerage, which is a different Burke. I think his name was Leonard. Not positive off the top of my head. So things move along. The Register's being published. Lots is going on. None of it very good, unfortunately. Basically, we have some organizations that get created in order to make people special. Mayflower descendants to connect people back to the original Mayflower passengers. The Daughters of the American Revolution to connect people back to the Revolution. And those kind of things. And whereas up until this point, many Americans had maintained discretion about their actual or imagined descent from royal or noble blood, it now became much more public. And they were relying on the notion of heredity and genealogy and genetics to legitimize their claims for social superiority. And this becomes a problem, and basically, in my mind, is a dark time for genealogy because it is the rise of the eugenics movement after 1900. And what we find is an interest in genealogy leading to blood pride and a disdain for others who were not Anglo-Saxon. And we find, whereas in the past we had fraternal organizations where people would gather because of, for example, occupation, now we have lineage associations that people are gathering because of their blood connection to some event in the past, generally associated with Anglo-Saxons. So genealogy would be used to prove their connections, and genealogy now becomes part of racial politics. So by 1900, there are about 70 societies that are organized and restrict their membership on the basis of ancestry. And basically, these become social clubs, and like people are all joining together. And there became a need to prove one's pedigree in order to become socially important, and genealogy is part of that. So in this time frame, what we see is the creation of several different societies that are patriotic in their orientation, not so much social. Society of the Sons of the Revolution in 1876, then the Sons of the Revolution in the 1880s, which was a splinter of the Society of Sons, and then the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution was created in 1889. Well, after that, because all three of these societies would not allow women to join them, we find in reaction to that the creation of the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Daughters of the Revolution. And basically what we find is these patriotic societies are nationalizing genealogy. For patriotic hereditary societies, genealogy was a means, not an end. And in fact, we sort of see that today, although the world has changed since then dramatically, and doors have been opened that were not open before. But we still see even today that with the SAR and the DAR, people need to do the genealogy or have someone do the genealogy for them in order to join. But once they've joined, very few are actually interested in continuing in genealogy because they're more interested in belonging to the organization. And that's pretty much always been true from the very beginning. But what we see happens is in reaction to these hereditary societies, we begin to see the creation of ethnic societies in order to create a counterbalance. The Germans, the Huguenots, the Scots-Irish, the Swedish, the Irish, the Jewish, they all create societies that are basically, in their mind, demonstrating that they're as good as Anglo-Saxons, although they may not necessarily word it that way, although some do. Some will say things that everybody's thinking but not saying. But out of that, the Scotch-Irish have a publication that goes on for years and years and years. I have 2 bookshelves full of them. The Huguenots, Charles W. Baird does a 2-volume history of Huguenot immigration to America. So from these organizations, we also get a lot of histories and a lot of material that's very useful to genealogists today. But at the same time, because of this need to all of a sudden acquire blood pride and social status, this is a time of fakery. And lots of people are making things up. And even today, how many of us have coats of arms hanging in our house that if we were to actually research them, we would learn that they actually were the coat of arms of some defunct house somewhere, in my own family. And in fact, I have it stashed somewhere, no longer on my wall. Or maybe it's on my wall somewhere in some hidden wall in my house somewhere. I have a Roberts leather coat of arms that my grandfather was very proud of, his coat of arms. Unfortunately, they were the coat of arms of the 5th Earl of Radnor, who had no issue. And there's a lot of this going on. In fact, you can go to places like Colonial Williamsburg today, or you go online and you can get your own coat of arms for a fee. Or if you're really special, you can spend $1,000 to $2,000 with the various Lord of Arms in either England or Scotland, depending on what your background is. And you too can be issued a different set of arms. The money goes to the Inland Revenue Service. And I know several people who have done that and several people who are my friends who have arms. But the focus at that time was not necessarily that associated with consumer protection. And what they were more interested in was, hey, look at me, I've got a coat of arms, whether they were valid or not. You see a lot of genealogies today that are printed that will include a single color plate possibly in a basically black and white interior book, or it's on the cover and there's a coat of arms. And if you were to research the coat of arms, it would be interesting to see whether it actually connected to that individual or not, or even to that family. Just because you have a surname doesn't mean you have a coat of arms. Coat of arms don't go to surnames, they go to individuals. Well, in 1903, the world changes and the National Genealogical Society is created. And it's the first national genealogical organization, although for many years, even when I belonged to it, it was known as the Potomac River Genealogical Society. It tried very hard to be national in its orientation, but it continued to be overshadowed by the New England Historic Genealogical Society for many years. And it's only been within the past few decades that it's actually come out from the shadow of NEHGS. I can remember in the late 80s, we were looking at who could get to 10,000 membership rolls of 10,000 first, NGS or NEHGS. And it was a neck and neck race and it flip-flopped back and forth for several years until I no longer looked at it. But one of the nice things was we now have the National Genealogical Society Quarterly. Actually, I've been on the editorial board of that for 28 years. The NGS Home Study course was created in 1981. And then one of the probably most unheard of things, but not well-known things, I should say, but one of the most important things that NGS did was sponsor the Gentech data model. I guess this was about 20 years ago, maybe a little shorter period of time, where a data model was created to help software developers create genealogical software. And data models are important to software creation. And what was interesting is, although I was not part of this effort, at the time that this was going on, I actually was a data modeler with DoD while I was in the Navy. So it was interesting to watch that unfold, although I couldn't participate in it. That's a little bit more modern stuff, but let's go back to right after 1903 or stuff. Let's talk about the 1920s and 1930s. There is Donald Lyons Jacobus, and he is probably the mainstay of genealogy as we know it today, from the perspective of he wanted to imply that genealogy should use the scientific method, should use primary sources, and we get all this guesswork and all this fakery out of genealogy, and we move forward. And he published a lot of books. Early Families of New Haven comes to mind. But he also published what would eventually become TAG, the American Genealogist. And he was known as the Dean of American Genealogy. Now, about the time that this is going on, the American Library Association puts out a memo in 1926 that says, as a general custom, public libraries found it inadvisable to devote any considerable amount of time to genealogical work or to specialize in genealogical departments and collection. Now, isn't that an interesting phenomenon compared to what we know today? Well, Jacobus, in order to fix this, surrounded himself with some people. George Andrews Moriarty, who was a civil servant and a lawyer. Arthur Adams, who was the librarian at Trinity College in Hartford. John Isley Coddington was an instructor in history at Harvard. Milton Rubicam was a civil servant at the Commerce Department. And Meredith Colquitt was an archivist in the National Archives. Now, I actually had the pleasure of meeting three of those people, John Isley Coddington, Milton Rubicam, and Meredith Colquitt. I used to have milk and cookies or milk and cupcakes or milk and something, sometimes tea, with Milton every Thursday afternoon for about a year and a half. I was running the National Genealogical Society library on Wednesday nights, and one of the things that I would do at the end of the evening was pick up the National Genealogical Society books that were to be reviewed in the quarterly, and at that time Milton was the book review editor. And at that time I was the Clan Scott genealogist. So I would on Wednesday night pick up books, and then on my way home from work on Thursday, I drove, he lived in West Hyattsville, and at the time I was living in Brentwood with my grandmother. So I would drive within 2 blocks of his house in West Hyattsville on my way home every day. So every Thursday I would drop books off and sit and talk with him for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes. He was a joy to talk to. And I would ask questions, and we would kibitz, and we would talk, and it was fun. It was from him that I learned that if you're going to use a numbering system, you should use NGSQ, because at the end of the genealogy, you know how many people you have in the genealogy, and you can't learn that from the register. With the register, you have to count them one by one. So that's the tidbit that I remember the most. I also remember that in looking at his house, the second floor structure appeared to be bowing and sinking in the center of the floorboards. And that's because he had this huge library on the second floor of his house. There were books in every nook and cranny, and he had center things like kitchen islands, only they were in his library, and workspace and all that kind of stuff. It was just a joy to see what he had. Eventually, his collection would end up with the National Genealogical Society. And it's in I don't know where it is now, but it was in Glebe House when they were in Glebe House. I met Coddington and Colquitt and Rubicam in 1990 at the National Genealogical Society conference, and they held a panel discussion where I actually was one of the people who was picked to ask them a question. And I remember the question, and I remember their answer. It dealt with North Carolina and Tennessee and the census and all that kind of stuff. And I was really happy. I also met that same day Grace Murray Hopper, who you may know, Rear Admiral Hopper, from her experience with submarines in the Navy and COBOL and that kind of stuff. But she was an avid genealogist searching out her Murray connections. Anyway, these were the guys that made it all happen. And let's go over some of the ways that they made it happen. Jacobus published many books, but one of them that he published was Genealogy as a Pastime and Profession, and it's in print right now. And I recommend it for anybody who hasn't read it, so you can sort of get his view at the time that he was operating. He started at the age of 16 publishing articles, but he created his own magazine in 1922, which would later become the American Genealogist. So the New Haven Genealogical Magazine, 10 years later, would become TAG, which is the most scholarly publication that we have these days. And it's not affiliated with any society or any university or organization. It's totally self-supporting. In 1936, the Detroit Society for Genealogical Research was created. And in 1940, Adams, Colquitt, and Coddington would create the American Society of Genealogists. You've seen the initials FASG after people's names. Well, those people are fellows of the American Society of Genealogists. They allow 50 of those to exist at any one point in time. And Adams was number 1, Colquitt was number 2, and Coddington was number 3. So I don't know when they decided that they would cut it off at 50, but it took them a while to get to 50. In 1941, they added Donald Lyons Jacobus as number 4, Louis Effingham de Forest as number 5, Harold Bowditch as 6, Milton Rubicam became 7, Rosalie Fellows Bailey became 8, George Andrew Moriarty became 9, William Godwin Davis became 10, and Mary Campbell Lovering Holman became 11. And my homework assignment for you, should you be interested, is for you to go out and see the contribution of these people to genealogy between, say, 1900 and 1941 that allowed them to be selected as the first almost dozen individuals who would become fellows of the American Society of Genealogists. Now, in 1892, I'm backing up a little bit, Earl Greg Schwemm began the William and Mary Quarterly, which was associated with Williamsburg and the College of William Mary. And he became the 12th member in 1942. So I'm not going to go through the list of the 171 fellows that there have been. As soon as someone dies, they take their time, but eventually they'll pick someone to replace them. And if you go out to the American Society of Genealogists websites, you can find out who the current fellows are, and you can imagine some of their names. And then you can go out and look at the names of all the fellows. And you can see basically when people died, who's living and who's dead. In the 1950s, we begin to see that public librarians and archivists begin to become nicer to genealogists. And that's because largely they recognize there's so many of them around and they're a voting bloc. Now, at this point in time, there are a few large libraries that have genealogical collections. The Newberry Library, the Detroit Public Library, the New York Public Library, and of course the Library of Congress. And at this point in time, in the early 1950s and through the 1950s and 60s, patrons begin to expect to find genealogical collections in libraries, and they sometimes are upset that they don't exist. Libraries figure out that it's a way to attract people from far away to come and visit them. So they're adding an additional catchment population for their services, because generally we find that libraries today anyway have basically three kinds of people that visit them. They have mothers with children, there are genealogists with mobile filing cabinets, and there are indigent people who spend most of their time in the bathroom or sleeping at the desks. And those are the three kinds of people that mostly frequent libraries today. Back in the 50s and 60s, they had less problem with the indigent population. So in 1952, Tennessee creates a state genealogical society is created. Then Louisiana in 53, Oklahoma in 55, Alabama in 58, Idaho in 58, and Ohio in 59. And Ohio manages between 1959 and today to pretty much put a local society in almost every county in the state. Now in 1950, there's a change. Meredith Colquitt, remember one of the Jacobus group, creates a 3-week workshop in partnership with American University and the American Society of Genealogists, of course he's a member, and the National Archives. And this 3-week workshop goes on at American University for a number of years, and eventually the Library of Congress and the Maryland State Archives will join them in the partnership. In 1972, it moved from the American University to the National Archives and became the National Institute on Genealogical Research, and it was conducted by the archives. And I think it was in 1992, maybe. I spoke at the Institute. I think I've spoken there once or twice, but that was a long time ago. And today it's known as GenFed because the initials of the National Institute on Genealogical Research in the National Archives didn't suit people very well. Now, to build on that, in the 1960s, at Howard College, which is now Samford University in Birmingham, the Institute of Genealogy was created. Eventually, it would transform into the Institute of Genealogical and Historical Research there at Samford, and a few years ago, it moved to the University of Georgia in Athens, where it now is housed with the Georgia Genealogical Society, who have taken it over from the library staff of the Samford University. So now it's gone through 3 iterations, 2 in Birmingham and now 1 in Athens. What also happened in the 1960s is the involvement of the Church of Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ in genealogy as outreach. Before the 1960s, the church's focus was on providing genealogical programs to church members only. But they began to realize that they had a marvelous opportunity to do better work by acquiring the resources of non-church members and providing information to non-church members. So they began to create family history centers, a network of family history centers. And by 1968, there were 75 of them around the world. About that time, the Genealogical Society of Utah began to organize. It continues to this day, and remember that it is responsible for both the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy and also the Colloquium, having taken it over from me several years back. In August 1969, there was a World Conference on Records in Salt Lake City. I think I have the program for that in my library, and it's amazing the number of names of people who I don't know. I mean, there were so many people involved in that conference that I just never encountered in all my life. I actually didn't become involved in professional genealogy until 1985, when I found the National Genealogical Society and learned that I had been doing genealogy wrong all of these years. And so I took it upon myself to take a course of education that would pretty much get me to where I am today. But it all started because of the efforts of the Church of Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ, the National Genealogical Society, the efforts of the Fellows of the American Society of Genealogists, IGHR. All of these things all combined together created basically a hotbed for genealogy and making it accessible and available to most everyone. Now, there's an interesting person out there by the name of Jules Chodak. Before World War II, Jules was a book collector and a dealer interested in Americana. In the 1950s, and he owned a company called Regional Publishing Company. In the 1950s, he began to republish out-of-print genealogical materials just because he was taking a chance on the market. And he changed the name of his company to the Genealogical Publishing Company. And his son, Barry Chodak, today still continues to build the company, which he acquired after his father's death in 1968. By 1968, half the books that Genealogical Publishing Company was selling were genealogical books, and the other half were those that Jules had collected over the years as a book collector and a dealer in Americana. And Barry would eventually sell all of that off or reprint those pieces of it that he could. And basically he built the Genealogical Publishing Company into what is today about 2,000 titles. In 1977, Heritage Books, under the auspices of Laird Toll, who was a research physicist at the Navy lab, began Heritage Books as a family company. And he started out as reprints, and he would build his collection of reprints. And then he started doing new titles. And eventually in 2003, he sold Heritage Books to me, and I had been Willow Bend Books prior to that, and I had purchased Family Line Publications in 1999. We've got Family Line Publications in 2000. We've got Heritage Books in 2000. We've got Genealogical Publishing Company in 2000. We also have Southern Historical Press, which was created by the Reverend Lucas, and is now run by his son LaBruce, and then Clausen Press, which still exists today. And those are some of the majors. Mountain Press and Iberian have been around that long also, and each one of those has about 2,000 titles. Clausen has about 2,000 also. That's the field of genealogical publishing, which all evolved since the 1950s, 1960s, largely because Jules Chodak took a chance and demonstrated that genealogical publishing, it would be possible for somebody to make a living doing that. Not much of a living, but a living. So in 1964, there was a joint venture between the American Society of Genealogists, notice they're building genealogy again, and the National Genealogical Society, notice they're building genealogy again, and they created together the Board for Certification of Genealogists. And at that time, there were certified genealogists, American lineage specialists, or genealogical record specialists. And in 1992, I started out as a genealogical record specialist, And sometime in the 2000s, all the genealogical record specialists became certified genealogists, and both the genealogical record specialists and the American lineage specialists were dropped, but a certified genealogical lecturer postnomial was added. And their job was to help to establish standards and distinguish between professionals and quacks. And even in this time frame, in the 60s, there were still quacks. The Beatrice Baileys of the world with their books of this surname and their books of that surname. People who just made stuff up. And some people continue to make stuff up. Then in 1979, the Association of Professional Genealogists was created, and it's now the world's largest association for professional genealogists. It has a fantastic international outreach program going on, and it represents more than 2,000 genealogists in 40 countries around the world today. And their focus was to support those engaged in the business of genealogy through advocacy, collaboration, education, and the promotion of high ethical standards. So the Board for Certification of Genealogists and the Association of Professional Genealogists both have code of ethics, and people who belong to that organization subscribe to a genealogical code of ethics before they're allowed to be members. But in the 70s, there was this thing called Roots. Alex Haley's 1976 novel Roots, The Saga of an American Family, first aired in January 1977. It was a miniseries, and it just took the world by storm, and all of a sudden everybody was interested in doing genealogy. There was a sequel, Roots, The Next Generation, in 1979, and a second sequel called Roots, The Gift in 1988. 2016, there was a remake of the original miniseries. Now, I've seen all of them except the remake, so I'm going to have to go search that one out. But there was a lot of kerfuffle associated with Alex Haley at the time. There was a lot of, but nobody paid any attention to that except for genealogists. The general public didn't care. And basically, the general public got exposed to the fun of genealogy, and all of a sudden, everybody wanted to be a genealogist, almost. At least one per family. I don't think there's more than one per family. That's just anecdotally. I haven't really looked at it, but if you've got a family that in the same generation, there's more than, if you've got a sibling who's a genealogist and you're a genealogist, you're what I call lucky. Because I'm the oldest of 8, and none of my siblings want to be genealogists. They're more than happy to say they have a brother who's a genealogist. I'm not sure whether they have a smirk on their face or not. So what happens in the 90s and on into today, genealogy becomes much more accessible to the occasional user than it ever has been before. In the old days, you had to visit a courthouse, and some people believe you don't have to visit a courthouse anymore. How wrong they are. In the old days, there were mug books, and everybody would have the county history on their bookshelf. Now they go to Google Books to get a copy of it. The web basically exploded, genealogy being the second most used kind of website out on the web. I won't discuss what the most used is. And we began to see the creation of both free and subscription services like FamilySearch.org and like Ancestry.com and like Fold3 and Genealogy Bank, MyHeritage, and some of the others that would provide services to genealogists and make their money that way. I don't think I could survive as a military researcher without Fold3. It makes my life easier than it was in 1985. I want to leave you with a final thought. Probably the two most important things that have happened in genealogy are evidence explained, the citation standards that now exist, the guideline of citation standards that now exist, that without citation, genealogy is crap. And without evidence explained, we would have a lot more crap than we have. Also, the Board for Certification of Genealogists throughout the years has created genealogy standards works, and they're now in the second edition revised, and it now includes DNA, something I really haven't talked about today. But in the scheme of the history of genealogy, DNA is rather new. If you don't own these two books, you should. If you have never owned Evidence Explained, you should, or you do own it now, you should read the first 2 chapters. They're the most important things that you can read about being a genealogist and what it is to be a genealogist and what evidence is and what citation is. So those first 2 chapters in Evidence Explained are most important. There's also in Genealogy Standards and in Evidence Explained the process model, something that we have that we didn't have 20 years ago. There are also 80 standards in Genealogical Standards. If you have any questions or comments, and I'm